Greetings everyone and welcome to the Mark of History, and today we'll be discussing how a salt mine, nuclear waste, and cat litter resulted in billions of dollars in damages. Let's check out how this left its mark on history. So to start off with, let's go on a little about nuclear energy, or rather just energy in general, you see. There's a big debate going on, well, rather recently, especially in the past even 10 years or so, about just what kind of energy the United States or the world should use. Obviously, we're currently in the fossil fuel age of coal and natural gas and all that, and that is still probably the majority of power plants used, and it produces a majority of the electricity. But obviously there's pollution concerns and that going around, and obviously, while I have my own opinions on that, that'll wait for another time, the fact is that they are looking for alternative solutions. Obviously the most immediate is something like, for example, solar panels or wind turbines. However, there's one major problem. Well, we all know the massive wind turbine farm out there in California, and despite all these massive amount of turbines, they are still lacking in quite a bit of electricity around the LA area and often suffer from rolling blackouts. The other problem is with solar panels. While yes, solar panels are a good idea, and they could power a building if you put a whole row of them on your roof, the fact is, in order to power a good majority of the United States, you would have to fill the entire state of Arizona and some surrounding areas entirely, every square inch of it, with solar panels. Meaning solar panels, unfortunately, ain't a plausible solution to the problem, at least not to become more efficient. Now, obviously, there are hydro plants and that, but obviously this requires damming and everything else like that, which is a whole nother environmental concern to people already. So what we are left with at the moment is one major solution: nuclear. Now, nuclear holds its own set of risks, especially, we all heard of Chernobyl at this point, and we all know the dangers that are associated with it. How it can basically, wipe out an entire community with just one simple meltdown. Unlike most power plants, where if they, I hate to say catch fire, other than the immediate individuals inside the plant, there's no real danger of it, wiping out the entire bloody community, unlike nuclear plants. You also run the risk of, making an entire area uninhabitable for, a couple thousands of years. But nevertheless, at the end of the day, nuclear power is probably the only real solution we have that's relatively clean, and I say relatively, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the fact is, the only thing that produces a majority of nuclear's power's pollution, I guess, that you see that coming out of the smokestack, is just steam. Because essentially all nuclear energy is basically just steam. But let's get into how it's made for a little bit here. You see, nuclear fuel rods, or uranium fuel rods as they're called, are basically mined up from the earth, and through a process way too complicated to get in and would take an entire couple hours to explain, they basically created into these rods of, pure uranium, which are slightly radioactive. I don't know, I'd say probably to the tune of approximately actually zero. It would surprise most people to know that, the big uranium fuel rods of pure uranium, actually they're entirely safe to touch. You can walk up to them and you would be fine. It's the used fuel rods that are a bit of a different story. So basically how they are used is they're basically put into a nuclear reactor and submerged in water, and that water creates steam, and that steam basically powers the turbines and that. We all know what happened, at least most of us do, at Chernobyl. Basically, one of these fuel rods got stuck in the water, produced too much steam, melted the plant, and, we all saw how that went. But that is besides the point. Spent fuel rods are the big issue here, and why a facility that we will be talking about today needed to be created. You see, uranium fuel rods have a bit of a unique property. We all know a nuclear half-life in that. We know it lasts quite a long time. You see, approximately 10 years or so after they've been submerged in a large pool of water, but really they remain dangerously radioactive for about 10,000 years. To put that in perspective, we as a human race came up with the ingenious invention of farming and completely revolutionized our entire civilization in about that time. Meaning that for 10,000 years at least, these fuel rods would become instantly, basically, death traps for anybody who would approach them. But that's not the half of it, you see. That's just dangerously radioactive. These things are still very, dangerously radioactive, even past that point. Even some say up to 200,000 years. That's like 20 times even what our modern human history can comprehend. That is how insanely dangerous these fuel rods are. And so, the United States government decided they needed a way to get rid of these things. Now, obviously, the immediate suggestion probably got put up of launch them into space, which I'm sure some of you are probably thinking, but the problem comes about with, eventually you're attaching I don't know, tons of nuclear waste onto a explosive rocket. You can see where I'm going with this. It's a bit dangerous. One of these go bad, and let's just say you're contaminating the entire area with boatloads of radiation. So now the government needed to find a place to store this, well, as it was starting to accumulate tons of radioactive material. So in 1973, after some heated debate in New Mexico, they decided on the Carlsbad, New Mexico, near the Delaware Basin salt beds. Why the salt beds? Well, to simply put, because for 25 million years, these entire location essentially has remained untouched by tectonic plates, meaning if you're planning on storing nuclear waste for approximately 200,000 years, as some are projecting, obviously it isn't going to get touched for quite a long time. And thus, the WIPP facility was born, or WIPP being short for Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. Well, a kind of a self-explanatory name if you ask me. So basically this plant is essentially a giant underground cave, approximately 2,000 to 3,000 feet under the earth, and essentially it is meant to store radioactive material for about 10,000 years. The approximate length that this stuff is supposed to be highly dangerously radioactive. Of course, it'll remain radioactive for a lengthy period after that, but the fact is that, well, after 10,000 years, who knows if we'll even still be here. That being said, the fact is that this facility is basically a giant underground cave where they essentially seal off large amounts of radioactive material. And this could be everything from, as aforementioned, the uranium fuel rods, to even just material exposed to radiation or just other radioactive stuff. Basically, it's all crammed into barrels and put away, sealed away forever. Now, obviously, there's one major problem that I haven't mentioned yet and I feel is a little bit necessary. The problem they began to consider is, well, it's going to be in there for 10,000 years, isn't that right? Yes, so what do we do if, I don't know, 5,000 years we're not here anymore, to explain to the people that, yes, maybe don't go cracking open the ancient archaeological facility holding, I don't know, tons of radioactive material, because we don't know what the Earth will look like 10,000 years in the future. It may be highly advanced, maybe we might live in Walking Dead world. The fact is that we don't know. And the problem came about with, how do you warn somebody 10,000 years in the future? We barely understand some of the languages we find now. Heck, there's some Greek languages we don't even understand. That's something maybe a couple hundred years in the past. In some areas, it is insane to think that, let's see, Greece language, let's see, yeah, there's one there we haven't even discovered yet that's approximately 2,000 years old. That's not even a fraction of 10,000 at this point. So how do you warn somebody 10,000 years in the future? Now, a variety of things will warn. Well, every language is placed on there for now, but they discussed possibly even a picture. But, for example, a picture of somebody walking away from a dangerous facility, for example, or opening up the door and then falling to dust, would be a bit different if you read it, for example, if you were like Japanese and read it backwards, and suddenly somebody opened the door and they went from dead to being alive. That might give off the wrong impression. And the most interesting one discussed was, it was by a scientist who I assume was having a room pumped full of methamphetamines, because they came up with the ingenious idea. Now, mind you, these are government-paid employees. Yes, scientists, if you want to call them that. Yes, I can't believe I'm reading this right. They basically came up with the ingenious idea of breeding cats. Yes, stick with me here. Breeding cats, and I quote, to glow in the dark when exposed to high levels of radiation. Now, don't ask me how they were going to do that, because they didn't have a clue in themselves. But that's not the best part. You see, then they were going to create a grand myth around this nuclear glowing cat thing, which would warn people that, well, these facilities were dangerous when approached because their cat was glowing. Yes, that was their master plan for 10,000 years. They were going to try to come up with some kind of earworm to basically, I don't know, warn people with glowing cats. Yes, these nut jobs got paid for their work, if you want to call it work. Anyways, this is all besides the point. They basically just slapped some stone on it for now. They still haven't come up with a solution to that. This is all besides the point. We're getting off track. The fact is, this facility is fascinating. Let's just say that. You see, there was one incident that happened a few years back. You see, not that long ago, in fact. As I may not have mentioned before, I don't do much modern history, but even this caught my eye and struck a lot of question as to just how safe these facilities claim to be. In 2014, on February 5th, around 11 a.m., a salt truck caught fire, prompting the evacuation of the facility. 6 workers had to be taken to the hospital with smoke inhalation, release next day, yada yada. The fact is that a fire by a radioactive, basically, dump is not exactly what you want to do. But that wasn't the best of it. Only about 10 days later, on February 15th, all the workers had to be evacuated because the air monitors had detected an unusual amount of, radiation levels at the facility. Then very next day. The fact is, the facility and 139 workers were underground and had to be evacuated all at once, pretty much. And basically, this radiation leak which occurred actually ended up leaking outside this facility a bit, which is how they initially caught it. But this is not the most interesting event that happened. In that same year, on April 15th, the major problem would happen, which would result in, well, quite a dilemma, if you will, and resulted in billions of dollars in damages. Obviously, as I said, April 15th, well, the 158 contact handle radioactive waste containers, basically gigantic tubs of radioactive material located in room 7, panel 7 of the underground repository, essentially, well, released a ton of highly toxic and radioactive material, leaking approximately all at once. And yes, it took them this long to figure out that all this radioactive material that had started way back on February, well, that was coming from that facility. Anyways, after a while, they began to do an investigation. Now, they had to seal off this plant for approximately a few years, essentially, and keep all employees away just to get the radiation levels down to a safe level where people could actually begin to work on the problem. Now, in the end, what basically happened is all of these barrels basically started to rupture and basically almost catch fire, if you will, and release this radioactive material for one major problem. You see, what happened is, and I kid you not, all of these barrels were packed with the wrong material. More specifically, the wrong brand of cat litter. I kid you not. That's right, the fate of the world and risking highly radioactive material from leaking out into the universe is held back by cat litter. Again, I kid you not. You see, the problem was organic cat litter was used instead of clay cat litter. Why is this important? Well, you see, my friends, organic cat litter uses wheat byproducts to absorb the stuff, and the clay cat litter uses a mixture of compounds and materials and chemicals and that, basically what most people would deem unsafe for the environment. So basically what ended up happening is an individual at the facility brought the wrong brand. Yep, it came down to a brand detail. That is how ridiculous this whole thing is. Yes, it is insane. Basically, the guy brought the round buying a frickin' cat litter to stuff into the barrels to seal off the stuff. It is just insane to me. The fact is, cat litter, well, clay cat litter to be more specific, is a bit more fascinating. See, these materials are more than just useful for absorbing some acidic compounds, if you will, and some odors. It is actually very good at actually absorbing and maintaining nuclear byproducts in that, and nuclear waste from escaping out into the atmosphere, and also keeping temperature regulated. This is all very important. Whereas if you take organic cat litter, which is essentially wheat mixed into a flammable substance at high temperatures, you see you get a bit of a problem of, well, you risk basically the barrels exploding a little bit. Obviously not going to erupt into a giant firewall, but they will basically crack open and you suddenly have tons of nuclear waste leaking out into the atmosphere. But in the end, this entire plant, on January 9th, 2017, was finally reopened after cleanup costs of $500 million, which was ironically significantly less than forecast, was finally reopened. But the problem was the damage was done. It began to draw into question people's, at least the people in the areas especially, questioning of whether safety and everything else was being followed 100% accurately at this facility. After all, you probably shouldn't be ordering your cat litter just kind of on a whim off of Amazon. I don't know where they ordered it, but I kind of picture the guy just kind of ordering a giant box of cat litter to get shipped in. That's kind of a funny image to me. Anyways, and basically the only thing they could really do about it though was just basically review safety procedures and put more in place, and well, that was it. There's not much you can do about it in this situation. And in the end, the facility is still active, I think up until another 3 or 4 years. But the problem is they will have to close the facility down, not because it's dangerous, but because, well, it'll be full. And this is where the major problem many people come in. Obviously, we can't get rid of this nuclear waste, and if it's contamination and deadly up to 10,000 years, what do you do with all this highly radioactive material? Well, honestly, we still don't know yet. As I mentioned before, the idea has always been suggested to launch it into space, but the problem is without 100% accuracy on fuel rockets, and then in risk of them blowing up and contaminating large areas, there's no risk to do that, and plus it's just way too expensive. The fact is that, to be honest, there's no real solution. While nuclear energy is better probably for the immediate environment, there's problems with the ground environment. But overall, nuclear energy will probably still be the primary form of energy being used. Obviously, if more facilities like this can be created, the problem is that there's leaks and blah, 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 blah. But the fact is that at the end of the day, will we probably see more of these facilities and more of these problems in the future? Unfortunately, probably. Will cleanup still cost a lot of money? Unfortunately, probably. But we can only hope that, obviously, these situations hopefully begin to get better in the near future. Obviously, the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository is one of the newest ones being opened up in Nevada, and hopefully they have learned a bit of a lesson as to whether or not, well, you should buy the right brand of cat litter. Anyways, this has been a Mark of History event, and yes, I say event because, well, let me say, when I first heard about this, I almost found it comedical. I know, maybe laughing at nuclear waste possibly leaking in and destroying the universe is not exactly a pleasant thought, but the fact is that the fact it was all done because somebody bought the wrong brand of cat litter is a bit important. So, my friends, I leave you with one little word piece of advice. Check your brand of cat litter. Goodbye.